This is number 3 in my Sadler's Honest Reviews, in which I take a look at books having to do with philosophy and its applications to everyday life, personal development, leadership, and a lot of other topics. This time we have Stoicism and the Statehouse, an old philosophy serving a new idea, by Pat McGeehan. And this is a particularly interesting work because it is about leadership, and in particular political leadership, and it's by somebody who is serving in the West Virginia legislature, who's served 3 terms there, and who has run for higher office unsuccessfully at this point, but really somebody who you can say is walking the walk that he's writing about. So I'm really looking forward to telling you about this, and I'll say a little bit up front. So this was sent to me by Pat McGeehan. I've talked with him briefly about his book and his work in a phone call. Interesting work. On the whole, I would recommend it. There are a few things that I will say about it towards the end that I did find problematic, but yeah, on the whole, I would say if you want to understand not just Stoicism in general, but also how it might apply to not only political leadership, but other cases where you have to take stands quite often in situations of conflict, I think this could be a very useful book for the average reader. I always like to begin by talking first about the structure, the style, and a very brief summary of the book. So let's jump right into talking first, I think, about style. It's well written. I think that it's very readable. The average well-educated reader is going to understand a lot of the references. McGeehan's pretty good at explaining things through analogies to the present day. So I think that on the whole, the style is very conducive. Let's talk about the structure. So after a rather laudatory, well, there's acknowledgments and then a laudatory forward by James Aragon, who is retired from the Air Force. There is an interesting preface here by the author talking about how he wound up getting into Stoicism and how the household that he grew up in was one that stressed military duty and how these fit into each other. So you can tell this guy's already got an affinity for Rome because of that, and in particular the person he's going to talk about, Cato. Part 1 is focused on, well, there's an introduction, actually, I should say, and the introduction is quite interesting because in it he's framing Stoicism in relation to the other main, you could say, governing philosophy that runs throughout the book. McGeehan is clearly a libertarian. He's registered as a Republican, but you pretty much have to do that because the Libertarian Party is very weak in most of our states. And looking at his voting record, he does seem to be a fairly consistent libertarian, not just in terms of the right side of libertarianism, but also on the left side. He is a very strong advocate of personal liberty, and he sees Stoicism as connected with that. So you're going to find that discussed in the introduction. Then in the first part, which is just entitled Stoicism and is fairly short, he's giving you kind of an overview of, it's really only it's only about 11 pages long. He's giving you an overview of some basic Stoic doctrines and a little bit of history of ideas as well going along with that. Then he's got a chronology, sort of a year-to-year set of dates that begin with the death of Socrates and end with Marcus Aurelius' death and the Meditations later being released and a lot of the other things in between. Part 2, which I would say is really the bulk of the book, is let's call it a biography of Cato the Younger, a political biography and an intellectual biography as well. Cato is not somebody who actually wrote, but There's a lot written about him, and what we see is McGeehan situating Cato within the context of essentially the breakdown of the Roman Republic, spanning several generations. So that's the main part of the work, and then we actually get to the part that I probably like the best, which is entitled Stoic Counsel, subtitled Applying the Classical Method of Moral Conduct. And what this consists in are 20 little subchapters, each of which has a title and then a quote either from Epictetus or Musonius or some other, Marcus Aurelius or another Stoic, and then McGeehan's reflections on this and applications or amplifications, sometimes as short as just 2 paragraphs, sometimes several pages in length, and then it concludes with a listing, a bibliography, which is actually quite long, recommended sources. That takes up over 20 pages in the back. So that is the structure. And if I was going to give a summary, in very brief, I would say McGeehan thinks that Cato is really the primary Stoic to look at in terms of how to comport ourselves in relation to contemporary politics. And he's giving you some useful overviews and some advice about how one might do that from the perspective that he is adopting. Let's talk now about some of the key ideas of this book. So I would say that if I had to pick just 3 of them, it would be Cato really is the guy, and then this contrast between statism and individual liberty, and then the necessity of adherence to principle, and indeed first principles, as McGeehan is going to call it, particularly in the third part of the work. So, let's talk about this very laudatory focus on Cato. I think Cato actually is somebody who, in thinking about classical Stoicism, one naturally does gravitate towards. He had a very impressive character. He was consistent to the end. He didn't write things down. Instead, he acted. And so we're somewhat dependent on other reports about him. And I think McGeehan's pretty even-handed in examining the record and in addressing, where there might be misunderstandings of Cato. Cato is definitely looked at as the model for the Stoic in this work. Then there's this, pervasive, you could call it, theme of statism versus individual liberty. It's very pronounced in the introduction to the work. And I do have to say that I think that McGeehan does a fairly good job in not skewing it too far to the side of contemporary libertarianism and, remaining within the Stoic orbit, let's call it. But it is definitely a Stoicism that is influenced by this emphasis on liberty. You're going to see that word over and over and over again in this work. And it almost always means individual political liberty. So that's a key idea as well. This notion about adherence to principle, this is another key concept that McGeehan stresses over and over and over again. That one of the problems that was going on within the breakdown of Roman society, and he thinks within the breakdown in the political processes within our own society, is that too many people, first of all, don't even have a clear concept of what principles they ought to have, and then when they do have them, they're kind of wishy-washy about them. They don't fully commit to those principles, so they're not really treating them as principles. And that brings me to another key theme, I would say, which is you might say principles or values are really non-negotiable. You can't compromise on them, because once you start to compromise, they end up getting lost in the process. So given that point of view, it's very understandable why Cato would be sort of the primary person to look at in here. Another idea is that we have to cultivate the virtues. He talks about the classic 4 cardinal virtues that Stoicism advocated. Justice, very important in a political context. Prudence or practical wisdom, also very important. Courage, which doesn't just mean getting out there on the battlefield, but actually standing up against being isolated, resisting in the face of what you know to be wrongheadedness or ignorance. And then finally, temperance. He really does stress the importance of temperance in here. And I think he does so in a way that aligns well with other treatments of temperance, where it's understood as almost like it's a good thing in itself, but it's also very instrumental in enabling one to be able to carry out these other functions that are necessary for the statesperson, for the politician, for the legislator, for the leader. Another key idea that is coming up is the focus on character and discipline. And this kind of flows out of the temperance and the justice and the courage part. But there is a very strong emphasis on developing one's own character. He's got some great advice here. Resist personal ambition, ignore the chatter from others. Where is this one? He's got a great one in here about familiarizing yourself with nonconformity. And there's another one in this part. Don't participate in trivial pleasures. Don't give anything sort of a handle on you. One of the other things that I thought was particularly interesting as a theme in this book, both illustrated by Cato and also talked about by McGeehan as something that applies to us in the contemporary political sphere, is you're probably not going to make a lot of friends, and you're probably not going to get power if you are actually a consistent lover of liberty on the one hand, or a consistent stoic on the other hand, or as McGeehan thinks, they go hand in hand, literally. If you're that kind of person, you're probably not going to do that well in the political climate. And it's interesting to see this advice coming from somebody who is, in fact, immersed in the legislative process, who's managed to get himself in there and not get himself, booted out, but who probably is a thorn in the side of both Republicans and Democrats alike, very much the way that Cato himself was a thorn in the side of pretty much every faction that was around, but he had grudging admiration, at least from some of the people. And I think one of the other key themes that really shines through the biography in that, which really is, like I said, one of the main portions of the work, is that Cato, to the greatest extent, and perhaps Cicero to some extent as well, are really trying to hold together the Republic by fighting this essentially lost cause. And there is no winning horse to place your bet on. Caesar is clearly the wrong guy. He's power hungry. He's corrupt. He is a populist. He's got all sorts of unsavory practices going on. Crassus is not a good guy either. Pompey is not a particularly good guy, but they do end up siding with Pompey during the Civil War. But it's not because they think that he's the best guy. It's because you have to choose some sort of side, and this was the least bad side. And I think that is one of the key themes, that in politics, when you have to take a position, you're rarely going to find one that's totally congenial to you. And oftentimes you do have to take the least bad side in a conflict. So those are some of the key ideas of the work. What were the features of this work that I particularly liked or found interesting or valuable? And also, will these be regarded as such by most readers? The answer to that, I think, is yes. One of them is I do really like the way the book is structured. This, basic discussion of Stoicism that doesn't try to do too much, then jumping into this long, situation of Cato within his own political context and telling a story essentially, then coming to some conclusions at the end that would be applicable in the present and still inspired by Stoic philosophy. I think that's a really great way to put this book together. And I do like his stress on Cato as the central figure. And I think that the handling of Cato is quite good. It's not just a hagiography. Cato is this wonderful guy who is perfect in every way. I don't think that's what's going on here. And I do think that McGeehan is good at setting out how the maneuverings and mechanics of the Roman political scene were in effect breaking down and giving way to all sorts of interesting power dynamics and opportunities, and Cato's own response to that as a Stoic. So I thought that was quite good. I think there's decent discussions in it of the other key figures, including why some people think that they're particularly good. I don't know that I entirely buy the thing of all of these guys like Caesar and Pompey are basically for state power, and Cato is somehow proto-libertarian. But you do learn a good bit about each of the people discussed in here, and the complexity of the conflicts. It's not simply reduced to a very schematic good guys versus the bad guys. There's really a lot of guys sort of competing with each other in a process that I think they don't fully understand, and they really can't get back on track. And then there's all the personality conflicts and stuff like that. So good job in discussing that. I think that another thing that I do like about the work is it sets out a very coherent, bold perspective. It's consistent. I think that this will be a useful book for people to take a look at. Even people who have been studying Stoicism for a long time will probably enjoy it. I don't know that they're going to actually learn that much from it, but they probably will find it interesting and enjoyable. And I think that people who are just getting introduced to Stoicism, this could be actually a good adjunct to reading some of the other literature that's out there, precisely because of its political dimension that it brings to the fore. So those are the good points about the work. The aspects of the work that I find problematic are pretty minor. I would say they might even be viewed by some as merely quibbles, but I do think that there are a few inaccuracies in some of the story that's being told. And it's not that surprising to me, because what we're dealing with here is kind of a complicated intellectual history. I don't think that McGeehan gets Stoicism wrong as such, but I think that he gets some of the history of ideas stuff wrong, or he just doesn't supply things that would be kind of useful. So, for example, he tells us that the Stoics, he essentially says basically that the Stoics are coming up with the cardinal virtues. They divided virtues into categories, building the latter Christian framework for the four cardinal virtues. Really, I think the Platonists deserve the credit for that. I would say that the four cardinal virtues, first of all, Plato talks about the four cardinal virtues, right? Because, Socrates had talked about these. But I think that historically, while Stoicism did have an influence on Christianity, I think Neoplatonism had a greater influence in that respect. There's kind of a strange assertion about Aristotelianism, saying that the Stoics are very much Aristotelians, asserting reality can be determined through experience. Aristotle does have that sort of stance, but this is not where they actually do line up, because what they view as experience is quite different. But again, that's kind of an epistemological quibble. But I do think it's coming from somewhere. I don't really buy into the story that he's telling about Plato and Aristotle and Stoicism in terms of politics, and I'll read a little bit of this. Plato and Aristotle had established political theories stuck in the collectivist quagmire of the polis or Greek city-state, unable to move past their statist environment. Little distinction was made between state and society. Molded together, the lack of separation generally equated the two, whereas the state became society. Diverging from these models, Stoicism's treatment of the individual enabled a new way of thought, helping to throw off the mental shackles of the state. So that's a nice contrast, but I don't think that it really holds up if you read Aristotle, read the politics, read the rhetoric, read the Nicomachean Ethics, and I don't really think it holds up for Plato as well. I mean, Aristotle actually says none of the existing, constitutions, meaning the particular city-states, actually are well structured. Here's how we might make it better. He gives you, lots of guidelines. And then, there's kind of a claim a little bit further on that the Stoics are really the origin of the natural law tradition, and they are one major origin, but so is Aristotle. Again, in the politics, the ethics, and the rhetoric, you find these discussions there. Which people like Cicero would help to bring together. So I think that's a bit of an issue. The chronology, I think, was kind of a good feature to have in there, but unfortunately, it leaves off after Chrysippus, succeeding Cleanthes with the history of the Stoics, and it doesn't talk about how the next scholarchs are actually the ones to bring Stoic philosophy to Rome, and how the Romans got introduced to it. So I think that's kind of a problem there. It's all about Roman history at that point, but nothing about the intersection with Stoicism. And then the modern references, like I mentioned, there's about 20 pages of references at the end. It just seems weird to me to include Thomas Aquinas or Dante as modern references. I understand that that's opposed to classical references, and I would say there's just a lot of books here, and I don't know how useful it is because none of it's annotated. So I don't see that as particularly helpful. But that's pretty much it. So my parting thoughts on this book, on the whole, I'd recommend it. I think that it's a good book to at least read through. If you're not particularly interested in political dimensions of Stoicism, then you might want to skip it. But if you are interested in the intersection between Stoicism and society and politics, particularly in the present, then I think you definitely want to get this book. The last thing that I'll mention is I have, a much wider audience than just an American audience, and what we're talking about here is an American legislator in an American state talking about how Stoicism might fit into the system that he's working in. But I think that the principles that he's discussing at the end would be useful for anybody who is thinking about, a principled way of doing politics in whatever system they find themselves. So it's not really limited to just an American audience. And so on the whole, I recommend the work, and I'd say I enjoyed it quite a bit.